Welcome to the UNBC Forestry Club Podcast. This podcast is recorded at the Seaford radio station on campus from the traditional unceded territory of Tenere. You're probably listening from other places in BC or Canada or maybe around the world. We encourage you to recognize the traditional territory you get to learn, play, and live on. All right, welcome back, smart people. So today is really special. We have a super special episode prepared for you because UNBC Forestry Club Podcast is out and about and made it to Vancouver, the headquarters of the Council of Forest Industry, aka COFI. And sitting across me is Dr. Kurt. Please correct me if I say this last name wrong. Is it Niquidet?
Niquidet.
Niquidet.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Niquidet.
Niquidet, yeah.
Yeah. He's the vice president and the chief economist of COFI. He's got a fascinating resume working as a forester, as a researcher for UVic and Natural Resource Canada. He was a director for the Bank of Canada, adjunct professor at UBC. And today, Kurt is joining me and the UNBC Forestry Club Podcast to talk about the forestry economy. Thanks, Kurt, for joining us, and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, this is forest economy is one of the topic that we can, if we want to talk about forestry, we cannot not talk about forest economy. It's a key component of the industry and a job of forester too. And I would just, I was doing some research about you and looking at your resume. You have this fascinating resume working all across Canada and as a forestry student at UNBC, we always just want to know how you become who you are, and then how the next batch of forestry students can maybe somewhat become you.
Sure, yeah, I could chat a little bit about that. I mean, I started as a forestry student. I went to UBC. I grew up in Williams Lake, and so came from a forestry background and had that interest in forestry, and always was kind of interested in the forest economic side of things. I think particularly given the fact that, growing up in Williams Lake, it was very evident how important the forest sector was to the economy. And then as I sort of, after I got my undergrad in forestry, I went down to the US and worked as a forester, but a lot on sort of forest economics type topics. And I really got more and more interested in economics, and I actually went and did my master's in economics at UVic. And that was sort of not just in forestry, kind of a more broader economics degree. And but I always kind of had that sort of forestry kind of background, and continued on and did my PhD in Holland, in Groningen. And a lot of the focus was on sort of resource economics, again, because of my background. And then after my PhD, my first position sort of, was down in New Zealand, and I went and taught forestry economics down in New Zealand at the University of Canterbury, and then back to Canada and worked for NRCan and maintained that connection with academics, as an adjunct professor at UVic. And then off to the Bank of Canada, because I've always been kind of interested in sort of the broader economy as well, not just the forest economy. And but my roots are in British Columbia, and my roots are in forestry. And so when the opportunity came up to sort of come back to the West Coast and back to forestry, I took it, and I've been at COFI for about 5 years, but maintain that linkage with UBC as an adjunct professor.
That's awesome. We as a club, as a forestry student, like I said, forest economy is a huge component of forestry and what we do as a forester in BC. So maybe let me just start with this questions with how important is forestry to the province, and what kind of role is forestry playing right now as a provincial economy?
Sure, yeah. We do an economic impact study every couple of years, and our last one was done. It was actually released in 2024, but there's always a lag with the data, so it was based on 2022 data.
Right.
And the contribution of the forest industry to the provincial economy was about 17 billion in GDP. And that's the direct effect, but also what we call the indirect and induced effects. So sort of if you think about all those ripple effects the forest sector has on the economy. And so if you look at just the direct impact of the forest sector on the BC economy, it's about sort of 2% of GDP. But if you consider there's sort of indirect and induced effects, kind of doubles things. So it's about 4% of provincial GDP. We're, in terms of exports, we sort of pack a big punch in terms of exports, where the forest products are the province's second largest export category. And so we're very focused when we think about the forest economy. We have to think, outside of our provincial boundaries, because so much of our products are going outward, and that's why it's important to be competitive, and it's important to, things like trade issues are important for the sector, because market access is so critical because we export so much of our production.
Right. And this is actually blowing my mind. It's only 2% because I heard this saying that BC Forestry pay for the hospital, pay for the schools, and that's probably back in the 80s. And but do you have a number for like rural communities up north? Kind of in the northern BC, where, because I can picture Vancouver is, there's not a whole lot of forestry economy going on in Vancouver, but like, with around Prince George, where the Mr. PG located, probably a little bit higher.
As a percentage wise, it's actually in our economic impact study, it is eye-opening, and to be honest, it was a bit of a surprise to me just how much economic activity associated with the forest sector happens in the Lower Mainland.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so there is a sizable contribution of the forest sector to the Lower Mainland. A lot of that's in the sort of indirect and induced effects, as well as things like, if you think about the services sector, that's or the transportation sector, that's basically relying on the forest sector to move product to market. But that being said, as a percentage of the overall economy of the Lower Mainland, that's much smaller. But if you take what we traditionally think of as forestry dependent communities, Prince George, Williams Lake, Campbell River, the actual economic footprint as a percentage of their overall total sort of regional economy is very large. And so, there's some instances where you can see sort of over 25-30% of that sort of regional economy being dependent on forestry.
Right. And I assume the United States is our biggest trading partner, so probably same for lumber or forest products as well.
So overall, just to give you some stats on our latest exports, last year I think we exported about 11 billion worth of forest products, and nearly I'd say about 60% of that for the overall forest products went to the U.S. The rest is kind of going all over the place, but mostly kind of Asia Pacific. But for softwood lumber, the percentage to the U.S. is a bit higher. So about 75% of our softwood lumber exports are destined to the U.S. And then after that, if you think by value, it's probably Japan, and then next is China. Okay. By volume, it kind of switches around. China is maybe a little bit bigger than Japan, but what we're sending to Japan commands a higher value. It's a higher quality lumber.
The J grade.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So if you think about it in value terms, it's actually we're sending more there than to China.
Since we're talking about this, let me just address the elephant in the room. This 25% tariffs. Okay, the President Trump is gonna. Sounds like we have less than a month of break for this 25% tariffs coming in. Like, what does that mean to our forestry sector? And like, is forestry student gonna have a job in the future? Like, how is it gonna be? Like, what is this tariff gonna have impact on BC?
Yeah, I think it's important to start off is we're already facing duties on our softwood lumber exports, right? So, every year the Department of Commerce goes through this process. It's called an administrative review, and that resets the duties on softwood lumber. So last year we went so for most of the year we were kind of at 8%, which was kind of a low level, to it almost doubled. It went up to 14.4%, and that's what we're currently dealing with right now. And then we're expecting that the duties are going to go up again this year as part of the next administrative review. But then all of a sudden we got Mr. Trump who comes in, who also says, well, on top of that, we are thinking about a broad-based tariff on Canada of 25%. So this, our understanding is that that would be in addition to any of our existing duties. So it could be really impactful, where we could, if we're thinking about we're facing 14% already, or 14.4%, and you add on in 25%, that gets us up to over 39% of sort of combined duty tariff. And that's to our major market. As I mentioned, it's 75% of our exports are to the U.S.
Yeah.
And I guess the key thing is that also the 25% tariff that's being contemplated is broad-based, so that would affect forest products that weren't being impacted by duties, pulp and paper, plywood, orange and strand board, all those products as well. So I think, all of Canada would be impacted, obviously negatively, from a broad-based tariff, but the forest sector could have outsized impacts just given the fact that we're already facing, these duties. The thing is, though, is that the U.S., for softwood lumber, they need our softwood lumber. And so, if you think about the U.S. consumption of softwood lumber, about 70% of that comes from domestic production from the U.S. 30% is imported from elsewhere, and the majority of that, vast majority of that, comes from Canada. So if they impose these duties and tariffs on their shipments, that adds a cost. It's like an import tax, and we expect that that's going to end up, and we've seen it in the past, having price impacts in the U.S. So some of that cost is going to be passed through into the U.S. Prices, and impacts the U.S. consumer, impacts the affordability of lumber, and ultimately the affordability of building a house.
Sounds like everybody else but Mr. Trump understand. Even me as a forestry student, I'm like pretty much half-assed my forest economy or the microeconomy class. I'm like, I have very minimum knowledge about economy, but I know that the importer pays the tariffs, right? It's so if you think about from a United States, from a citizen perspective, is they gonna eventually pay the price? But sounds like the president doesn't understand that. Like, well, what do you think? Because he must know this, right? He must have a big, important people to teach him this. What do you think is, like, what kind of good it's going to do to U.S.?
Yeah, and I mean, it's broad-based. It's really, on forestry, you think about the microeconomic effect, but if you think about sort of across-the-board tariffs, which was what's being contemplated both on Canada and Mexico, and then some level on China, and now there's even talk on the EU. That's really going to fuel. If you think about broad-based price increases, then you're thinking about inflation, right? And so ultimately this will have an impact on inflation in the U.S. And the U.S. we just been through high inflation, right? And so then it makes the job of the Federal Reserve difficult, because they are under sort of a mandate to keep inflation low and stable. And so I think that's the bigger issue around tariffs, is that there's going to be macroeconomic effects. And we also can see impacts on exchange rates, a lot, because it is sort of a macroeconomic sort of policy. But going back to the forest sector, I think because we have sort of the duties already, we just could see an outsized impact on the costs passed through into the U.S., but not all of it. Typically, you don't see the entire amount of the duties or tariffs being passed through into the U.S. consumer. some of that has to be borne by the producers in Canada.
Okay.
It tends to be depend on market conditions. When demand is really strong, they can tend to pass through a lot more. But in other instances, not so much. And so it's kind of a sharing of the burden between producers in Canada and consumers in the U.S.
Got it.
Yeah.
And now I want to talk about BCTS. BCTS under review right now. I think it's one of the mandate that the Minister of Forest got as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong. So BCTS is created because the U.S. is, oh yeah, you guys, subsidizing your industry. We need a market-based timber pricing system to kind of reflect the market. So it's not just fair price and whatnot.
Yeah.
So right.
Yeah.
So is BCTS do you think is it still functioning as what it's supposed to be? And because from my understanding, they're supposed to. It's because the softwood lumber dispute. But we have BCTS, we're still getting more duties. We're also getting tariffs. It sounds like they're not serving the purpose, like why you initially created, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so just going back on the history of BCTS, you're right. It was sort of a lot of the sort of thinking around creating BCTS and was there to support the market pricing system. That was the mandate, is you auction off 20% of the timber through BCTS,
Yeah.
and you use those results to create the market pricing system, which is basically you're translating those auction results to the sort of longer term tenure holders, the stumpage fees there. And that was a way for us to sort of show that there's no subsidies in Canada and address these sort of allegations from the US. And it's actually been quite successful if you actually look at our duties. There's a couple components to our duties. There's a sort of a countervailing duty and an anti-dumping duty.
Yeah.
And the contribution of BC stumpage to the countervailing duty has been very minimal. And part of that is because we have market-based pricing through auctions. And so the concern has been, though, I think more recently, is that the system was designed such that BCTS would sell 20% of the volume and to sort of support MPS. But more recently, the last 3 years, they haven't been selling what they've been apportioned, and they've been missing their targets. And so it starts to be a question about, if that goes on for a long time, whether or not they are able to support the market pricing system. We have a long data set, so I think we're okay for a bit, but it does become a concern. The bigger concern, I think, with BCTS is just the fact that they're supposed to supply 20% of the volume to the market. Mills need that, and particularly if you think about a mill that doesn't have tenure, they require purchases from the open market. And so there's been a lot of, I think the concern from my perspective on BCTS has been, is more about that, is just the reliability of the supplies, coming to market and making sure that they are, auctioning off their apportionment and bringing that fiber to the market so that, these producers who rely on it can depend upon it, and that they're seen as a reliable supplier. And I don't think that is the case right now. And I think in terms of the BCTS review, I think the focus should really be on getting BCTS back, getting that fiber to the market, and making sure that they're reliable and people can depend on that sort of stable flow of fiber coming to the marketplace.
Well, what do you think is the reason behind that they cannot put on 100% of volume on sale? Because I work for different licensees, like pretty much everybody's complaining they just can't, they're not putting 20%, right? Likely around 10, 13% maybe. What's the reason behind that? I'm just always curious, like why are they behind?
Yeah, I think there's been a number of factors. Probably the biggest factor was when the old growth decision, the deferral decision came down. And so BCTS was, they had to sort of defer right away And from what I understand, about a large proportion of their standing timber inventory was caught up in those old growth deferrals.
Okay.
And so then they had to go through and go like, okay, we need to go, re-engineer these blocks or go try to build STI, standing timber inventory elsewhere. And that then they start to crop up against, the next biggest issue is that it takes so long in this province to develop standing timber inventory to get a cutting permit, right? And this is not just an issue facing BCTS, it's also the major licensees. It's a long, complex process to, start, the process and finally get to a point where you can actually get a cutting permit issued. These people have been saying it'd be like a 3-year process,
3 years,
right?
Yeah.
So that I think BCTS really fell behind. They were kind of falling behind before the old growth decision for a number of different issues. But then that old growth deferral decision really hit them hard, and then they've really struggled to rebound from that. And part of that is just because it's an onerous process to get standing timber inventory sort of developed.
Oh, so that's great. And then one last question about BCTS, or last couple, is my friend and I, and we're graduating this in April. BCTS hiring right now, and then we're always joking about don't do BCTS right now. You're gonna run out of the job at the end of the year. Do you think that's true? Are they gonna shut down BCTS and then completely cancel this program?
I don't think that's the intention, from what I understand, is the review. I think what they're looking at is to maybe look at the mandate of BCTS, and so it's just getting started, and but I don't think the intention, from what I understand, is to shut down BCTS. It may be that it may have a different governance structure, it may have a little different mandate. I think that's my understanding to date, but things could evolve as they're looking and they get feedback about BCTS. Things could change, but I think that's what I've my understanding of the process.
Because we also talk about forester from like Swedish forester come here and tell us they don't have stumpage, like all their airport tax happen at end products. Do you think that would be a model to go in the province? Like get rid of BCTS, like no stumpage, you don't have to do this anymore?
Yeah, I don't think that's actually true, no stumpage in Sweden. I don't know who told you that, but the landowners collect a fee for their wood, so it's whether that's on a roadside basis versus standing timber, that might be a question, but I'm quite certain there's
stumpage there.
There's some sort of either a log, if you're a sawmill and you're purchasing from a landowner, they're not giving it to you for free. Like, they're
imagine.
Yeah, they're paying for that either for the logs or the standing timber. So that's I think what's different in in Sweden and Scandinavia is that it's more private land, right?
Right.
And so there's thousands of landowners within Sweden, and Finland's the same as well. And but there's a market process, and there's some cases where some of the sawmills may have their own forestry land, and maybe that's the case. You're not actually having to pay stumpage to yourself. There's some internal transfer fee or something like that.
Right.
But yes, I don't think that's correct that in Sweden and Finland that there's no stumpage, or they're not giving away, a landowner's not giving away their resource, especially they have to spend all this cost to grow it for 110 years and do all the thinning and everything else. So I'm pretty sure that's not the case.
I probably heard it wrong and interpret wrong. So that's good. Anything else about BCTS you want to talk about here that I didn't ask? Sometimes I just don't know enough to ask smart questions. What do you think about BCTS that forestry students should know at UNBC Or is there anything we can just move on to if you don't have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's a BCTS, again, as I kind of, I guess, reiterate that it was originally set up having a clear mandate to support the market pricing system and to auction 20% of the timber in the province. And I guess it serves a very important role, though, because it's there to support the pricing system, which is, quite a important policy, obviously, right, for the major licensees and other tenure holders, that pricing function. But I think just as importantly is it's there to be a reliable supply of timber. And I think it's that aspect. I think, as BCTS has started to struggle the last few years, that it's been that component that I think where I've heard, that it's just really important for BCTS to get that fiber out there to the marketplace because people rely on it. And so I think that's important to emphasize as well.
Perfect. Now I want to switch to value added. Another topic, you go to any kind of forestry conference, they all talk about it. I heard they've been talking about this forever, and we had a bunch of value added manufacturers come out on the podcast, and then we went to the wood engineering research lab on campus in Prince George. I always get the vibe that almost feel like our industry don't want the value added industry. They kind of have this, they don't have tenure, they just don't have enough manufacturers in BC or in Canada. I heard they have 5-ish engineering wood or mass timber manufacturers in Canada in total. And the production is not even enough to support a major project. So I just want to kind of pick a brain. And where is this value-added manufacturer things going? Is this the future of BC, forestry? What's your thoughts on this value-added whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll put my economist hat on when I'm talking about value added, and because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about even just what we mean about value added.
Yeah.
For example, everyone has a different sort of thought in mind. You mentioned mass timber when you're talking about value added, and so that's been a source of confusion for one, and then. So I guess the one thing when I think about value added from an economics perspective is that value added is actually happening at all parts of the supply chain. So when we take a log and we turn it into lumber, that's adding value, right? And then when we take that lumber and we remanufacture it say if we take the lumber and somehow build a truss out of it, or we do some remanufacture to get some clears out of that lumber. That's adding value. So I guess that's the thing is there's value added happening at each part of the supply chain, and we actually quantify that from Stats Canada. We actually have numbers on how much value added is happening at each of those parts. So the sort of forestry and logging component, the sawmilling sector, the sort of remanufacturing sector, or other wood products manufacturing, the pulp and paper sector. They're adding value, right? Because they're taking this low value chips and they're turning it into something higher value, which is pulp products or paper products. Right. So there's an added value happening at any production. But in BC, traditionally, people think of value added. What we often hear is the value added sector. Yeah. And I think what people are really meaning there is the secondary manufacturing. And so, and I actually used to work for Natural Resources Canada, and we used to do these surveys out of the secondary manufacturing survey. And you talk to people from the value added sector, and they kind of point to that as being value added. But it's really secondary manufacturing. So that's sort of taking lumber and sort of building on and adding value after that. And so I think a lot of people, when they say value added, that's what they're meaning.
That's what.
Right. Yeah.
There's misconception. I have that too.
Yeah. And so it's quite common. But sort of, again, putting my economist hat back on, there's value added happening all along the supply chain, not just sort of after lumber. And it just doesn't make sense to say that there's no value added from taking a log and turning it into lumber. Like the log was $100 a cubic meter, and we're turning it into something like $300 a cubic meter worth of product. There's value being added there. And again, that's something that the international economic definition of value added would support that. And our statistics at Statistics Canada, they track all of that according to that definition. But in BC, when we're talking, sort of traditionally about value added, I think really people are meaning the secondary manufacturing.
Yeah. And the secondary manufacturing is I'm going to stop using the value added. I'm just using secondary manufacturing topic. People talk about it a lot because around Prince George, we kind of, industrial logging starting post Second World War, 1950s, and clear cut stuff 1970, 80-ish. So we're just at the corner, the famous, the Bower clear cuts and everything. Like the thinning is around the corner. Like we just have a massive land base that's ready to be thinned. But one thing about thinning is the wood that comes out of the thinning portion is not as good as the primary forest. The ring is not as tight. The knobby, they typically think about like the thinning forest, the thinned forest, like the product is like the low value product.
Right.
So people thinking about is air quote at value, right? Either do a finger joint or do mass timber or do have this state of art pulp industry or something can turn this low grade, thin wood products into a competitive product on the market. Do you think that's where we should go?
Yeah, I mean, if you look to what Scandinavia has done, there is a lot of management and thinning, right, all along, and sort of like I think they can sort of do 1 or 2 commercial thins before sort of a final harvest.
Yeah.
And they've gotten really good about utilizing those sort of thinnings along the way, and that can be in their pulp and paper sector, but they also, a lot of it's around the bioeconomy or biomass, right? And I think part of it, again, it comes down to economics. A lot of this, there can be policy levers that are in place. But any value added, even if we're talking about mass timber, and I think you were sort of alluding to like, do we support value added or not? And it's like, as an economist, great, yeah, but it needs to make economic sense, and so I think there's times when we've really kind of looked at value added and trying to do more value added, but in order to do more value added, you really need subsidies, and is subsidies the right way to go? That's a big question, and I don't think it's the right way. I think business, it should stand on its own. If there's sort of value added to happen, and there's a sort of a true value added opportunity, we don't need subsidies to make that happen. It should be a business sort of decision, and there's a market signal to say that we need value added. And so, I think in Scandinavia, why some of I think it's a bit of a mix. They do have some policy levers which are probably helping for maybe more value added on the pulp side, or, one of the key things is in Canada, we just have really low energy costs. Like if you think about on the energy side and why they can sort of utilize all that bioenergy in Scandinavia, they don't have a lot of natural gas, right? And if you look at the pricing of their power in Finland and Sweden, it's really high compared to Canada, like it's maybe double. And so that's actually a signal, or that's encouraging a lot of the sort of economic activity around biomass, is because the price of power is just so much higher, and so then that sort of enters into the broader discussion within Canada too, around things like carbon pricing and so forth. Right, there's another reason why they can do a lot of these sort of forestry products, is because there's a very high carbon price in Scandinavia. In Sweden, it's like $170 a ton. But forestry as a renewable resource, kind of those energy products are exempt from that. And so that's encouraging things. But in Canada, people have been loath to accept carbon pricing for a number of different reasons. And so there's kind of a mix on a lot of these, I guess, sort of if we're going to be changing what we produce and having more value, it can be sort of, it depends a lot on whether or not there's going to be a policy lever to encourage more of it, or whether or not there's going to be technology that sort of changes as well, or just the general, basic supply and demand market economics that sort of create the opportunity as well.
Yeah, we had a professor, briefly talk about stuff like this. Is we can talk about, in future we're going to move on this direction, that direction, but the margin. You got to think about the margin of this industry. If we move on to biomass or secondary manufacturing, like what kind of margin do we have?
Yes.
Is it even enough to support people and communities?
Yeah, I mean, one of the sayings that I think is needs to be kept in mind is like value added is not necessarily margin added.
Right.
And there's a difference there, and businesses think about margin added, and so. I think that sometimes just making more value added, it just doesn't make the economic sense. You just can't get the margins out of it. Sometimes you can, and I think companies are looking more and more to do more value added, and I think certainly it's not something we should stop trying to do, but I think we just need to be realistic about it, and it needs to be rooted in sort of sound economics, I think, in order for it to last. Because if you're going to end up subsidizing it and so forth, then as soon as those subsidies go away, then that business case kind of goes away as well. And so how does society want to ongoingly subsidize some of these activities? I think that there could be more productive uses for those funds, right? We talked about schools and hospitals, and
Yeah. Do you think BC Forestry is highly subsidized right now? Because I heard criticism coming to us is like, BC Forestry is highly subsidized industry. Do you think that's a true statement?
I don't think it is, no, because I mean, and we look at sort of our going back to our market-based system where we auction off our timber, and so that's through a competitive auction system, and when those auction results get translated into our market pricing system, and so it's very hard for me to sort of hear that argument, like where is the subsidy? It's a competitive process, and then again, like when we do these cross-border comparisons between our stumpage rates and Washington State, it comes out that there's basically not showing a subsidy, right? Like there's very little difference between our and Canada, or in particular BC, we're a high cost jurisdiction, right? Our log costs are much higher than anywhere else in the US and they're all based on markets. And so I just don't see the subsidies. There's certain funding that happens, things like Forest Enhancement Society of BC, right? And that's really around sort of funding on forest management activities, or reducing slash pile burning and things like that. And so that's a different thing. And I think the objectives of that is not just commercial, right? There's sort of an objective to sort of either on the forest management side around fireproofing or some of these other sort of activities, or to get rid of slash piles, which they're concerned about the sort of environmental impacts of that.
Yeah, speaking of FEST BCs, Jason Fisher was our professor for our forest policy class, Forestry 408 at UNBC. I just gave him a shout out, Jason.
Okay, yeah, I know Jason well. Yeah, great guy.
Great guy. He's super smart. Sometimes I just wish I'm like smart enough to follow his lectures. Sometimes I wish I know more. He's just a great guy, and he helped us a lot connect with Elise Lard from a consulting company. I think a communication specialist, and then she helped us, connect with a couple other forest professionals, because we as a student-led project, we want to talk as much as as many professionals as possible, in wide range to economists. We also had conservation people on the podcast. We also had industry people. We just want to expose ourselves for as different perspectives.
Yeah, that's great. That's
possible.
The way to do it. That's great. Yeah.
Especially in forestry, because sooner or later you're just gonna get exposed. Might as well just do that when you were in school.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing that's, I think, one of the great things about forestry is it's very multi-disciplinary, right? And
it is.
And you're going to sort of be exposed to a wide range of different perspectives, and you kind of have to, if you're going to be a practicing forest professional in BC, you're going to have to sort of balance all those different values and views and perspectives, and it's what makes it very complex, but it also makes it an interesting field to be in.
Really interesting. And there's a famous quote, you've definitely heard this before, forestry is not rocket science, it's harder than that.
Yes.
There are a lot of things you have to juggle. There are a lot of things you have to balance. And balance is we use that a lot, but it's really hard because check, balance, and compromise, it require trade-off, and then it's just difficult and hard, and it requires a lot of brain cells.
Yeah, and this is where I actually think economics can help. I mean, I think there's a bit of misunderstanding on economics. Like a lot of people, when they think economics, they're actually just thinking about the financial aspect of sort of forestry, right?
Yeah.
And the commercial. But, if you think about, you mentioned the word trade-offs. Really, economics is about trade-offs. If you sort of go back to the basics of economics, it's like the allocation of scarce resources, right?
Yeah.
And that's about trade-offs. Like we have to make trade-offs because there's limited resources,
Yeah.
And a lot of times, sometimes there are win-wins, but a lot of times it's, well, we gain here, but we're going to lose here, and we have to trade off. And so I think economics is a good way of just thinking about problems in terms of those trade-offs. And there's a whole field of environmental economics, right, who are sort of thinking about trade-offs between sort of financial and commercial values versus environmental values, and they're trying to sort of quantify some of those environmental values, and there's a whole sort of a number of different techniques and associated with that.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit more, but before that, I just have a couple more questions about how future forestry economy should go. And we also, one of the mandate is community forests, and then more community forests, and then people will be saying we need to go back to smaller mills, family owned, or hire more people. But again, think about from the margin perspective, do you think that's a reasonable direction that we can go in the future, that get rid of the super mill, more community owned sawmill, pulp mills, or other secondary manufacturer mills? Do you think that's economically making sense to go forward with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing I'll kind of touch on a few different things is, one, I think just right at the start, we're talking about where do we sell our products. Most of it's being exported, right?
Right.
And because if we just think about the local market in BC, we're in the scheme of things, we were 5 million people. The consumption of wood products in BC versus the rest of the world is really small, and certainly the resources we have at our disposal is much bigger, and what we can produce here sustainably is much bigger than the consumption and demand in British Columbia. So that means we have to really think to sort of external markets, and we have to be outward focused when we're thinking about our production. And for that, we have to be competitive. And so I don't think it's, in order to be competitive in sort of those marketplaces, sometimes scale matters, right? If you think about sort of, but there's limits to that as well. If you build too big of a sawmill, you just have to increase your costs of transportation. So there's a sweet spot there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then sometimes too, for certain products, maybe if you're trying to produce more of a niche product, maybe a smaller size facility fits into that. All this to say is that I don't think we should be the ones to choose that. I think businesses can set up and decide what the right size is. The only caveat I would say behind whether or not government should get involved with any of those decisions are, I guess, two things. One, we want to make sure that we have competition, right? You don't want to have monopolies or that leads to bad outcomes. And we have a federal competition bureau and policy that's there to govern that. So sometimes in BC's history, they've decided that mergers and acquisitions couldn't happen, or they were conditional on sort of competition laws, maintaining competition. So that's one thing where I think needs to be sort of a role for government.
Right.
There also is what we would say on the distributional impacts of things. And so this is not so much, a lot of times in economics we think about efficient outcomes, and that's about making the pie as big as possible. Right? But then there's a question about how does the pie get divided up? And I think a lot of what is referring to people thinking about more community forests and different, more local sort of tenures and so forth, a lot of that is about the dividing up the pie, who sort of, and so that's a more difficult question to answer. It's kind of gets more into a political discussion, but certainly there can be, a case where you sort of want to have more local sort of economic activity, that you want more of the distribution of wealth to be sort of in the rural economy versus it going elsewhere. And so that's I think really when we're talking about those issues, I think a lot of it's around the distributional issue around forestry. The one final point I will make about that, though, is a lot of times, again, getting back to trade-offs, there can be a trade-off between the size of the pie and how you distribute it. And this is not just for forestry economics, it's for the broader economy. A lot of times when we go to redistribute wealth or income, we actually, reduce the overall amount of income that's available. And so there's a famous economist, Arthur Oken, who kind of came up with this analogy of the leaky bucket, right?
Leaky bucket,
yeah. So I think that applies in forestry too, if we want to have more of these sort of like, say, smaller scale forestry and so forth. And a lot of it's about kind of redistributing wealth to local producers. But a lot of times that ends up sort of reducing the wealth, and I think there's a leaky bucket potentially, and we have to be careful with that.
Right, because that's one of another criticism that we get as a forestry community is we need to stop our raw log export, or any kind of export. Like, why were we supporting the world demand of timber, right? We're cutting our primary forests, we're destroying habitats and whatnot, and so from my understanding, from what I learned just now, is if we shut down export, so you have the total amount of the pie will shrink, and right? Am I being correct?
I mean, what I was referring to was more broadly on sort of, I guess, some other issues throughout the province. I think when you talk about log exports, it's mostly a coastal issue, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So raw log exports, I think people think they're a lot more than they actually are. If you look at the actual stats, I think it's about 5% of our harvests are exported in raw log.
Raw log. Okay.
Yeah. And so it's actually not a big significant part of provincial sort of, I guess, harvesting. But it's mostly concentrated on the coast. And it's been a contentious issue in BC for a long time. We don't have an outright ban on raw log exports. We also don't have a full free market in exports of logs. There's this sort of surplus test that we go through.
Right.
And so that's why we do see about 5% of our harvest is exported. But they go through this sort of, I guess, surplus test. We basically are offering first right of refusal to the local mills. The one thing I'll say about raw log exports is there's instances where because for some grades of logs, the value in the sort of international market is much higher than the domestic market. And that may only be a small part of the actual harvest, maybe 1 or 2%. And if there's that 1 or 2% you can actually export, that may help the overall economics of harvesting that stand. Right. So if there was no log exports, that whole stand may not get harvested at all, and a huge portion of that wood from that block would not flow to the domestic market. So it's kind of a more complicated issue than what people make out. And the harvesting on, particularly on like very high cost situations on the coast, and the coast is a high cost area, right?
Like heli logging,
really expensive road building if you're not heli logging, steep terrain and so forth. And so sometimes just like having some raw log exports really helps the economics of a particular cutting permit, and it allows sort of harvest activity to occur, and that can help the domestic manufacturers, because that not everything from that block is going to get exported in raw log form. The majority is actually going to flow to the domestic market.
Good to know. Maybe that's a really good point. Maybe just go back to, if you think about how the future BC forestry economy can go, like what, because there are lots of conflicts right now in the province, and there are lots of mills getting shut down. There's a lot of criticism that I work in the industry for 4 years, and I came back to school, and then 3 years now. So I've exposed myself to all kinds of very divided opinions. Mm-hmm. Industries craving for access to timber, and then, environmental side of things, they're like, no, we need to stop logging our primary forest. And, what's your thoughts as where this ship should go? Like what, how can we still have a forestry sector, but also maybe consider some of the environmental side of things? Maybe I'm kind of just invite you to maybe put on a little environmental hat as well, maybe half and half. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes down back to sort of our discussion about trade-offs and trying to find the balance. And that when we're thinking about sort of the balance of all these values, that could be difficult, because every individual thinks a different balancing point, and so it's a big complex problem. I think the one thing that's been challenging for the forest sector is just the overall uncertainty and lack of predictability around what those supplies are going to be, and I think that's really hindered investment in the province. And so one of the things they're going through now, these forest landscape level planning processes, and these are meant to sort of, I guess, try to find those balance of a long-term plan, to sort of think about all those different values on the landscape and plan for it, and come up with a long-term plan. And then once that's set, hopefully that will provide the certainty and everyone will know that, okay, this is the amount of timber that's available for the industry. Yeah. And the problem has been is like that, and that's I think that's a good thing. That's what we need is we need that process to occur, but it's been slow to happen. And so I think that should really be made a priority, because until that time, it's very difficult for companies to make any sort of decision around investment in the province if they don't know if it's going to be 3 million cubic meters at their disposal in this region or 1.5, right? Like, how do you plan a business around that? And so I think that's got to be a big priority. And so these forest landscape level plans, I think they need to be sort of expedited, and so we can get to sort of greater certainty on the land base. And I think those those processes are meant to sort of be the balancing act around the environmental values versus sort of commercial values. And it's a difficult one. And I think they've been trying to make it more localized, because I think they recognize that, you know, that sort of trade-off is going to be sort of different at different parts of the province in terms of what the balance is, and there's probably no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly, yeah.
But I think it is important that, you know, those happen. Otherwise, you know, they happen quickly. Like, I think they've been too slow, and so I think if we could speed that up, and the faster we can get to a place where we get those done and there's greater certainty around the land base, I think you will see a more stable sector, and you won't see that so much of the, because even some of the decisions around shutting down now, it may just be because of the uncertainty going forward, and you know, you've seen, you know, maybe there's the AACs there, but really because of a variety of different issues, it's actually just not accessible. Even though and there's a huge undercut that's developed, right? Like, I think last year we harvested about 36 million cubic meters on our public lands.
What's the AAC?
And the AAC is still almost 60 million. So it's, and there's a number of different factors driving that big gap. Some of it's around the cutting permit issues, and there's sort of outstanding land use constraints. Some of it's just economics too, right? It's just not economical. And so the faster I think we get those sort of land use issues sorted out and get a longer term sort of plan in place, I think the better we'll be from the sort of forced economy side, because companies can plan and make the investment decisions and build a business around whatever that longer term plan is. Yeah.
Yeah, because if I put myself into a shoe of entrepreneur, where, you know, trying to start a business, I want a reasonable expectation of return, right? If I want to make an investment, and people have been saying that right now. I don't know, if you want to start a business right now, would you put money into forestry sector in BC? Like, why won't you go to the States or go to other jurisdiction to invest your money? Do you think BC right now there's a good investment environment for new people to come in, or other companies or trying to start their business? You know, why BC but not other?
Yeah, I don't think the investment climate is great right now, and that's not meant to be a criticism. I think, you know, it just is just I think the facts of the matter. And I think a lot of it is around because of this uncertainty over things. And for the forest sector, a lot of it is related to fiber supply. You know, like you know, if you think about any sort of investment decision or any of your cost side of the business, say 2/3 of that is going to be based on your delivered fiber supply. So it's a huge. That's why people are so focused on having a reliable fiber supply and the cost of that fiber supply. And so I think there's just a lot of uncertainty right now, and that's the quicker that we can get to a place where we clear things up, and you're always going to have uncertainty, right? You know, but if we can get things a little bit more predictable and reduce that uncertainty level, I think that helps, you know, make the investment climate better here, and I think you'll start to see capital flow back to the region. But until that time, it's difficult, and you know, I think a lot of our investment has not been flowing to BC because of that sort of lack of certainty.
You mentioned the FLP. In 2 days, I'm going to Victoria to meet the Deputy Chief Forester, Nora White.
Okay.
To pick her brain about the FLP, and because that's another thing people talk about. Sounds like this plan is going to solve all the problems, you know, from First Nation to environmental to economic. And we talk a lot about this in school, different classes. We all talk about forest landscape plan. I work in the industry, people talk about forest landscape plan. Yeah. So I really want to learn from the Chief Forest Office that, you know, where it is things going, what's the current state, and I'm really looking forward for that conversation as well. Happening 2 days. I'm so
well. That's
excited.
Great. Yeah. No, I think they'll know more than I about it. So we'll have to chat after.
Well, it'll be released, so you can check it out.
Yeah.
We also, because I know that I'm coming here to talk to you, I set up like a little public engagement thing that UNBC collect questions from students all over on campus, and I'm probably just gonna, there are a lot of them, so I'm probably just pick a couple, kind of ask you, and then see what anything you want to have a say. One of them is it's kind of diversified our forest economy, because right now is all about like wood product based, requires remove of the trees, and but there are like a lot of like mushroom pickings and guide outfitting, trapping. The other economic value that forests provide is the non-timber forest products, basically. So the question word for word is, why don't we put a price tag on other values that forests provide and diversify BC's forest economy?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what we're talking about in terms of what product, non-timber product that we're talking about, and whether or not we can develop a market or price for that or not. I think, you mentioned, say, mushroom picking. Well, there is a market for that, right? And so, and then there's now, like in certain jurisdictions, a little bit in BC, there's a price for forced carbon, right? I spent time in New Zealand, and they have if they're landowners, they factor in forced carbon into their decision making around growing trees on that site. But it's a different environment, because they're having to compete the land, deciding to allocate this land to forestry versus agriculture, and the sort of forced carbon credits that they get is helping to keep that land into forestry. So there's other jurisdictions where there's these non-timber values which are priced in a market. There's other sort of, I guess, values, non-timber values, where I'd say it's more difficult, and I'm very skeptical as to whether or not there ever would be sort of a market developed, just because they're what we would call public goods, and so it's very difficult. I think some people have tried to create either markets or crediting schemes around some of these things, but even for forced carbon, for example, it's controversial, right? There's all these issues. There's all these issues around, like, well, the baseline, what's additional, and whether there's leakage or not, and how permanent the carbon storage is. So all of them can get quite complicated. Some of them, I think, those hurdles can be overcome, but for some of these other sort of non-price, non-timber values, I think it'll be challenging, and I definitely think that it'll be difficult for them to ever develop a price or a market. And then there's a question of whether or not that price signal even represents the value, right? And so. Again, there's sort of some of these values are kind of public goods, and so it's I think in those situations it's difficult to kind of get a true market signal, and so managing it is probably a different way of doing it. There may need just to be sort of, this is why we go through landscape level planning, right? Where it's sort of more of a different way. It's not a market signal as to deciding how much we're allocating to certain environmental protections. It's just sort of a democratic process that we're going through.
Good to know. You briefly talked about the carbon accounting, and as a probably like most, I shouldn't say most, many of the forestry students would pick forestry because people talk about economy, which is turn around, right? We want to go out there in the woods, out and about in that environment. But I was gonna do like one episode dedicated to forest, the carbon accounting, and I don't know if you can just give it a very brief introduction. Where is the province at in terms of carbon accounting? Like, how's that plays a role in our BC forestry right now?
Yeah, I mean I guess the biggest part there's a macro level and there's maybe a micro level around forced carbon accounting in the province. Sort of at the macro level, the province has sort of an accounting of changes in our forced carbon flux, and they report out on that. And actually, the last several years, because of our wildfires, in the province, we've seen from that account, we've seen really big, significant emissions of carbon coming from the forest. And that's not because of harvesting or anything, it's because of those massive wildfires. And so that's the macro level kind of, I guess, accounting for carbon. But then there's sort of been the development of these forced carbon offsets protocols. And it's a really complicated sort of, 80-page protocol, right? Yeah. And that's more designed if on a kind of micro level, someone wants to do a project around sort of for a forced carbon offset protocol or project, then you have to establish sort of like what's these baselines, and then there's factors to account for leakage. There's factors to account for, whether or not this is a permanent, they're thinking over 100-year horizon, but what if there was a wildfire? You have to sort of account for that sort of, like in California, for example, they had all these forced carbon offsets, but a lot of them burned, right? And so you have to have sort of some, as part of your protocol, you have to have some accounting for this possibility of reversal of those sort of, any of that carbon storage. So it gets quite complicated, both at the at the macro level too, if you're thinking about carbon accounting, and then sort of at the micro level on these forced carbon offset protocols. I will say, from my understanding, the BC forced carbon offset protocol is quite stringent compared to that's there for what we would call a compliance market, right? But then there's these voluntary markets and standards that have developed as well. And there's a number of different ones, all with sort of, I guess, similar types of things that they're sort of trying to address: additionality, leakage, and permanence. But they do it all in different ways. And from my understanding is that the BC forced carbon offset protocol is quite stringent compared to some of the other protocols out there.
Perfect. I'm just reading through the question list. And why hasn't BC government adopted more selective based harvesting practices? I don't know if this is even a COFI question, but as seen in Ontario, despite their potential benefit for forest sustainability and long-term ecosystem health, it's basically this binary approach is either clear-cut or completely protected. And we're kind of missing this huge gap in our selective logging. Do you think that could play a role in our forestry practices in BC? More selectively harvest, either using shelter wood or single or variations of group selection, single tree selection.
Yeah, I think it depends on the ecosystem. I think we have so many different biogeoclimatic zones in the province, right? Which makes our province so great. It's so diverse. But I think there's certain ecosystems that are probably more, if you're going to be managing that ecosystem, that you would probably want to do more partial harvesting, selection, all these alternative silviculture systems.
Yeah, basically,
yeah. And so I think it really depends. It's a very forestry answer, right? It depends. And so I think that there's... then there's a question about, how do you incent that to occur? And I think you want to make sure that, in our appraisal system, that you're getting the proper allowance if you're doing a different sort of silviculture system. And so this is why it's important that BCTS is doing those activities, so we get the data points and experience in our market pricing system. I think now with the management of sort of fuel loads, right? There's probably around there's this wildland urban interface, and so in that you're going to be doing partial harvesting, right, to reduce fuel loads, and so but there's an added cost to doing any of those activities. Usually, the most economical kind of harvesting activity is sort of a traditional clear-cut style, right? And there's certain ecosystems where, it's just more, I think the natural sort of disturbance regime was such that you kind of had larger openings to, I'm thinking about pine, more of the certain pine spruce type forests, right? Which were kind of exposed to these initiating wildfires. And then you have other parts of the province where it's in the dry belt, Douglas fir, right? And it may be in mule deer winter range, and there's more of a partial harvesting system, a selection system that's set up. I think, yeah, again, it's in order for, and then you kind of get, now we're getting into second growth, right? And so then now you're getting into commercial thinning. And so I think there's going to be more of that as we sort of manage for wildfire and manage for different habitats and ecosystems. I think it's just a matter of making sure that you have the right cost allowance for whatever of those systems that you're going to employ.
Yeah. One of my, because at UNBC you have to write a professional report to graduate. So I picked my project to work on like exploring, like in Ontario, I went to college, Fleming, shout out to Fleming College, all the Frosties out there. They use a lot of, like in central Ontario, southern Ontario, they use a lot of single tree selection. So they can log in their park. So Algonquin Park,
Algonquin, yes.
The Halliburton Forest.
Right.
It's park and also have logging happening on the same land base. It's different forest. It's a mix with hardwood forest, different than like Prince George, let's say the sub SBS forest. But, because in my brain, this is just me fantasizing, thinking about this, right? Because with now more and more land designation towards conservation, the old growth deferral, the TAP polygon, there's the COFI, there's OGMA, there's all kinds of different things, right? There restriction, maybe park coming in. We can still, because people think about logging, they think about clear cut. Let's remove this every single trees and knock everything down. But there's also this beautiful single tree selection that people come in, do a very thorough walkthrough. You have this prescription, assess all the trees. You have biodiversity in mind when you're marking those trees. And actually, east of town by Prince George Town, not Vancouver Town, but they have a research forest, Liza Lake. They did a single tree selection, and then we walked through it, and then before they told us it was a cut block, because they took 50% of the volume out of the forest, and it was covered in snow. I didn't know it was a cut block until they told me it was a cut block. And I was like, whoa, wait a second. So there's, this visual presentation is fascinating that I think a lot of people don't know. So I'm thinking why we don't do more of these, maybe in park. People freak out, are you going to lock the park?
Or conservation areas, right? Like I think you can have areas that are kind of really more under a conservation kind of designation that may not necessarily need to be just protected no-go zones, right? That you may be managing them like that, the way that you described, particularly given the fact that, forests aren't static, if you, and if you think about still wanting to manage for wildfire risk, or, maybe some still actively managing these areas that are in a conservation designation, right? And so I think some of those techniques would be appropriate. And then, but at the end of the day, it's sort of, it comes back to some of the costs of that again too, right? It's going to be more expensive, and so how is that sort of costed out? And
because in my brain, because either no harvest because they're protected, but doing single tree selection because those polygon they're typically around town, so the cycling time was much shorter.
Yes.
So either no cut or use single tree selection, you can take some volume out.
Yeah.
It's also improved from harvest methods, right? Using single tree selection, because you're taking all the worst trees out and leaving the best in there. Also have some wildlife trees, the trees with the cavities on there, some blowdowns and stuff like that. So you kind of maintain the structural complexity, but also taking some volumes out.
Yes.
Also provide growing space for the regen or other even immature forests to grow. So in my brain, it's just a perfect system. And then why we don't do that in BC? So I'm just trying to work on this professional report, kind of explore like the pros and cons of using this, and cost obviously is a good one. But
I think that's got to be factored into some of it. But there's, like you say, I think some of those areas it may be too contentious to even, to do our traditional harvest, and so it's in the past it's been sort of in this sort of no log kind of dichotomy, and there's really a continuum in there, and so I think employing some of those innovative silviculture systems may end up being, striking a balance and sort of allowing some harvesting activity to take place. And you're still sort of managing and improving sort of, I guess, that ecosystem function, because sometimes when it's just left alone, it's not actually meeting all those conservation values that you're looking for either, right? So,
totally agree. All right, I'm just looking at the time. I have like probably 3 more questions and then kind of have to wrap it up. Maybe this is not on the, I was just thinking about this question as we talk, and I forgot to add this, is about tenure reform. It's another big topic people talk about. People, we need more area-based, we need more area-based, volume-based is outdated, it's, for the objectives in the past, and then now we need area-based because there are lots of reasons.
right.
Maybe I can list 2. One is because there are a lot of like ribbon wars in interior BC because you don't have this legal boundary of operation areas, so people can just come in. It's a gentleman agreement that you stay in your turf, I stay in my turf, but when you have shortage of fiber, people tend to break that rule.
Right.
And the second is for thinning, right? Because there's a pre-commercial thinning is investments. You're not making money from those.
Yeah.
But you're you're improving the condition of this plantation. Thinking about getting the return in the future, you don't have that for volume-based tenure. So what's your thoughts on this converting volume-based tenure to area-based tenure and the opportunity and challenges that comes with it?
I think it's something that we have to do. I think in terms of thinking about longer-term forest management, it's very difficult. There's been, if you sort of read BC's forest history, there's been attempts in the past to do sort of what I think in the late 80s they called it the rollover proposal, right? Where they tried to convert a lot of volume-based tenures into area-based tenures, and there was some public backlash and so forth. But I think it's worth having the conversation again about it. I think people recognize sort of probably some of our tenure regimes and property rights regimes are from a time of the past. So in general, I think area-based is better. The one thing I've heard as a pro around volume-based is that it sort of acts as a bit of an insurance policy because around wildfire and so forth. And so if you have sort of your 30 hectare sort of area-based tenure, and all of a sudden it just so happens to get wiped out by wildfire, then that's a catastrophic loss for you, right? Whereas if you're sort of a volume-based, as part of the broader TSA, there could be that 30,000 hectare sort of wildfire, but it's the impacts of that are spread across all the different holders. And so in terms of one of the pros around volume-based, it's around, I've heard some people advocate in terms of the insurance aspect, or like almost like a risk pooling sort of side of things. But I think that, I think the benefits of the area-based sort of really outweigh that, particularly as we're getting into wanting to do more management, commercial thinning, and so forth. And as scarcity sets in, as you sort of mentioned, right, there sort of gets to be sort of these turf wars, and it's unclear. And sometimes you can have, as a result, almost these tragedy of the commons kind of outcomes where people are doing things which may be in their own self-interest in the short term, but not in the broader sort of longer term interest. And so I think it's a conversation to be had. And so, I mean, this is one of the benefits of moving towards more community forests and so forth. They are area-based, right? It is, yeah. And so I think as a general trend, I think that's the right direction. It's probably a matter of just how exactly. There also comes the bigger question around the property rights of the trees themselves, right? Because even if you sort of move to area-based tenures and you have a tree farm license, for example, you don't actually own the trees. You have a right to harvest the trees, but when you harvest, you have to pay stumpage on it. So if you're thinking about those investment decisions around commercial thinning and different forest management for the future, and wanting to improve that sort of future stand, you may not be loath to make those investments, even if you have an area-based tenure, because who's going to benefit from that sort of investment? It's going to be the whoever owns the trees, and and so there's a question about just overall property rights and owning, who owns the trees themselves, or at least has equity in the forest too.
Right.
And so if you see other areas like Scandinavia, New Zealand, and the US, where they're doing this more active management, commercial thinning, a lot of it's on private lands where it's clear ownership of who owns those trees. And so that's always been a sensitive one within British Columbia, because people have really felt like public lands is what we need. But there could be regimes like in New Zealand where they didn't, they still had main public ownership of the land, but they had sort of a leasing system so there's different types of tenure arrangements that we could do to, I guess, encourage management, more silviculture and so forth. So it opens up a big discussion. And in the past, it's been a sensitive one, but I don't think we should shy away from it. I think it is worthwhile having those conversations about tenure reform in BC.
I agree, totally. Yeah. Maybe we can help too as a platform.
Sure.
With students, right? We just want to learn as much as possible. We just go talk to people and see what they think, and then kind of facilitate that kind of conversation about tenure reform.
Exactly.
So if you have all the power today, let's say you are the Minister of Forest, or you're the Premier, or you're the king of the BC, let's say, for one day, that you can change one policy in forestry just to make it better in any way that you want. So what would be that one policy you would make or amend or remove?
I think I would, one thing that I would, and it goes back to, I guess, certainty around the land base and trying to have, a healthy forest industry here in BC. I think it's important that we have some type of commercial forest, working forest designation in BC. And that could be area-based, where we have this is an area-based tenure system, but certainly just saying this is a part of the land that is going to be really managed for commercial values. There's been a lot of talk about 3-zone management and these different things, but I think it would be important to sort of get investment going back and get better certainty around sort of the longer term commercial forest sector, forest economy, that we have some type of working force kind of arrangement where people can count. Like in forestry, it's a long-term business, right?
It is.
And so people need to, and there's been a lot of changes in policy and that have created a lot of uncertainty about whether or not that sort of land base is really going to be there for the future. And I think that's created a little bit of a black mark on sort of investing in BC. So if we could kind of create some sort of working force designation that's really sort of makes it clear to investors that this is going to be managed for timber supply or commercial forestry, I think that would be helpful. And that's not to say that we're not going to manage for all these other values, but there's going to be a large area of the province, right? It's like we have, 55 million hectares of forest?
Forest, yeah.
So maybe if we just designate 15 million hectares to say this is going to be a working forest, and the rest of the sort of stuff we're going to manage for multiple values. I think that would be sort of the one thing I would do.
Cool. Any messages for forestry students at UNBC, for those people trying to make us sound fancy? We're going to be the next patch of forest management in the province. Any messages for people like that in school?
I would say just work hard, try out a bunch of different things. That's the one great thing about forestry, is it's multidisciplinary. I think it's important to sort of experience a lot of different things, try out things, and that way you learn about what you like and don't like, right? And you sort of can find a niche in it. You may want to just be a generalist, or you may want to specialize. But I think it's important, particularly as you're starting out in your career, to try a bunch of different things, and it's important to do that too, just to understand the broader kind of context. And so even if you do specialize, you can kind of see the bigger picture of how it all fits together.
Perfect. Is there any other topic that you want to talk about today that I didn't get a chance to ask? Anything you want to get off your chest? Anything that you want to you want to say?
I think we covered a lot of ground, so I think we can leave it there. But maybe I'll come back in another time and we can have another discussion. But I think we covered a lot today, so that was great.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And next time, if you're in Prince George, we have a forestry club. You can join us in the boardroom. We can sit down with a bunch of students. And so just not you and me, we have more students. We can have a group discussion. That'd be great.
Happy to do that.
Yeah. So, perfect. So once again, I want to thank you, Kurt, for joining me. I learned a whole lot today. This is really, we have a whole bunch of variety of different guests coming on. This is our first time talking about forest economy. Again, it's a big part of this forestry talk, so I just really appreciate your time. And normally I would thank the C4 radio station that's on campus as a professional radio station that we record all our podcasts. But today, obviously, I want to thank COFI for hosting me, that just letting me into this room. I'm in the headquarters of COFI, so that's quite something. All right, so this wraps up this episode of the podcast. We thank you for tuning in, spending time listening to us chit-chat about nature, forestry, and life at UNBC. And UNBC Forestry Club Podcast is a student-led podcast sponsored by nobody but a bunch of students who are passionate about forestry, the outdoors, the adventures. And new episodes drop weekly, hopefully. So stay tuned for more insightful conversation and inspiring stories. Until next time, let's continue to grow together, rooted in our love for the forest. Have a great week, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much. Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.